Hi everybody. This episode with journalists Ben Dunant and Danny Fenster, who was in prison in insane jail, is dedicated to all of the Burmese fighting for their rights and democracy currently languishing in prison in Myanmar, and to Sean Turnell, the Australian academic who still remains behind bars. Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's January 14, 2022, and today we are speaking with Danny Fenster and Ben Dunant, both journalists and contributing editors with Frontier Myanmar, about their experiences as foreign journalists leaving, living in and attempting to leave Myanmar in the wake of the coup. Hello, Danny.
Hello.
Hello, Ben.
Hello, Luke. It's good to be back.
It's great to have you back. Let's start with you, Ben. You and I last caught up on the podcast back in March last year when you were still reporting from Yangon. And since then, you, like most foreign journalists, decided to leave the country where you had lived for several years. So first, why did you choose to leave? And can you then give us an overview of your successful departure, immigration?
Sure. I mean, I left the country on the last day of March when, the big protests had already ended. The military had already begun to crack down. They increased the arrests that they were doing. It became increasingly dangerous to protest. Also, as a journalist, to any kind of open reporting, if you're a photographer, for instance. It was risky being seen with a large professional-looking camera. Now, I did leave at the same time as a lot of other foreigners, but also not only foreigners, but a lot of Burmese as well. Those that I knew were leaving at the same time. However, my circumstances were a little bit different, and I'd been planning for a long time to leave when I did. I've been working in this country since 2014, so it'd been more than 6 years. And I had this sort of plan since a while back, to work at Frontier to oversee publications coverage of the election at the end of 2020, and bring that to a close, tie up loose ends over the following cool season, and then leave around the time of the Thinjan festival in early 2021. And sort of looking ahead from in 2020, I assumed it might be quite a quiet time. The NLD had won another landslide victory. There's going to be a lot of continuity there. So I thought, it would be a pretty good time at least to take a break. I mean, I thought that I could come back. And then after the coup happened, me and my colleagues, we dove into reporting that as much as possible. We kept up quite a big reporting pace. However, as things got more dangerous, it did become increasingly hard to work in the open. We stopped using our office because other media organizations had been raided by the authorities. We had to keep our heads down. Even a lot of the reporters also had to sort of work remotely from where they were. So just trying to communicate with their sources through encrypted messaging and so on. So because of the coup, I did toy with staying a bit longer than I did. But once it got to the point when, it was actually quite hard to work openly, I thought, well, a lot of this editorial work I could do is easily from outside the country, with a better internet connection and so on. I'm not adding all that much just by being here. So then I did leave right at the end of March, and my experience at the airport was the same as everyone else's there. Didn't face any trouble there at all. I'd been staying in a safe house. I mean, just as a precaution, really. I remember when I was there in March, people would ask me, are you staying in your flat? And I'd say yes. And then they sort of look at me in surprise. And they thought that was a silly thing to do, because of the job I was doing. So yeah, I was taking a few precautions, I suppose. But then it was a bit hard to know what kind of danger I was in. And, but in the event, I was able to leave. But obviously, my experience is very different to Danny Fenster's, that I'm sure the Myanmar Musing listeners will be far more interested to hear about. So I'm going to pass the mic to Danny.
Yeah. There was a pretty similar lead up to to departure. But there was a process of, well, first of all, there was definitely that assumption that the worst that would happen to a Westerner is that they would just, kick you out of the country and send you home. And so when I was going to the airport, that was already what I was planning on doing. So yeah, no, I just wasn't worried. There was a period where I think we were kind of all holding our breath and watching journalists go home and sort of evaluating based on other people's experience at the airport. I think everybody kind of assumed the airport is like the moment of truth. And, when we all watched Ben leave, Ben had been there for so long, had always been sort of, a source of wisdom on the country. We thought, well, if they're looking for anybody, if they're looking for information, you're gonna, Ben might be in trouble. And when he went to the airport and then went home with no problems, there's just a bit of a sigh of relief and then an assumption that we're probably all right. There were other journalists with much higher profiles than myself that went to the airport and went home. So that was my assumption showing up. And then obviously things did not play out exactly that way.
So what was the atmosphere like in the time between Ben leaving and you deciding to leave Danny? And how long was that period? It was about 6 weeks?
Yeah, 6 weeks, between 6 and 7 weeks or so. There wasn't a dramatic change. There was obviously an escalation in the amount of violence that the military was using against its own citizens. But there seemed to still be this assumption that their interest in foreign reporters was mostly to get them out of the country, not to really detain them. I had witnessed, a Polish journalist basically get a slap on the wrist and sent home, and then a Japanese journalist sort of faced the same treatment. So there was a presumption, I think, as a foreigner that you're not in as much danger. There isn't a whole lot to fear, which to an extent, I was held for a very long time, but I wasn't treated the way that this military is treating their own citizens. I was never beaten or tortured, and I certainly could not say that for everybody that I was incarcerated with. There were definitely people there that had, before being sort of dropped off at the prison, had been beaten and had been held in much harsher conditions. So I was sort of shielded from that. But the whole experience of being held as long as I was held, there just was no premonition of it. I had no idea that was coming.
Yeah, and as most of our listeners already know, you were stopped at the airport. You were imprisoned for 176 days, becoming one of the few foreigners out of more than 10,000 people that have now been arrested by the military since the coup. That includes 115 journalists. So can you walk us through, do you remember much about that period, getting in the taxi, going to the airport, and then how did it happen, getting from your Yangon apartment to insane prison?
Yeah, it was a morning flight, so I had gotten up early that morning, and Juliana, my partner, we were living together, we had an apartment together. She wanted to come with, so we had gotten in the cab that morning, and she had come with me to the airport, and then we had, goodbye, hug and kiss out in front of the airport. And I was sort of texting her throughout the entire process at the, ticket check-in and going through security, going to the boarding area, and every stage seemed like a hurdle cleared. I didn't see anything coming. I didn't anticipate that I was on any list or any priority of the government. In the very back of my mind, I knew that I had previously worked for this news outlet, Myanmar Now, and that the military has a particular hatred of this one news outlet. And it was like, oh man, what if, that's, it's sort of in the back of my mind, but I just didn't think that was much of a threat. And then when I got to the boarding area and was just waiting to board, I had sent a text to Juliana, which was basically like an all clear, I was like, well, I'm in the boarding area. If they were going to do anything, they would have done it by now. I'll see you in 20 days. She was supposed to follow me to Detroit, Michigan. And then at the very, very last minute, while I'm sitting there waiting to board, a large group of police just walk up to the woman who was getting ready to have us all board, the last like ticket check before you walk onto the actual airplane. And these police sort of just told her to make an announcement that they were looking for Daniel Jacob Fenster. And it was just a very surreal moment. I just sort of like, looked up like this must be some sort of joke. It seemed pretty unreal. And I just kind of like timidly raised my hand. I was like, yeah, that's my name. Through a translator, they said, we want to ask you questions for a criminal investigation. And they sort of just pulled me aside to a closed off part of the airport. And then for like a couple hours, just drilled me with the exact same questions about where I worked and what I was doing, until they found at the bottom of my backpack a Myanmar Now business card that I had held onto as a sort of memento or souvenir. And when they found the business card, they sort of all let out like a sigh of relief, like this is something that they had been looking for the whole time or something. And then they were just like, well, now you're arrested. We think you work for Myanmar Now. I mean, there was a Frontier business card in there as well, right next to it. And I was telling them the timeline. I had previously worked for this outlet. I work for Frontier now. And I mean, that's just how that morning went. From there, they took me to another site where they interrogated me, asked the exact same questions for the entire day. And at the end of that day, they sat me down in front of a judge in a makeshift court. The judge just said, confirm that we have your name spelled correctly. And I confirmed. And then they said, well, you're charged with this offense, 505A. Your next hearing, I guess, is 2 weeks from now, and you're going to wait in prison until then. And it was all just very bizarre, and it just seemed like it wouldn't last very long. And I just started this process that ended up lasting for 5.5 months.
And Ben, you were texting and in communication as well. You were watching Danny's progress. What was this like for you and for Frontier Myanmar? When did you know that something had gone horribly wrong?
Well, I mean, as Danny said, it felt like a big shock. It was a big shock to him, and it was a big shock to us. I think on the same morning that Danny left, we were just emailing around about some articles that we were editing, and then I saw an email from Danny who was like, "Hey, I'm going to the airport now." And then he was talking to another colleague of ours who was sitting in Yangon, being like, "Hey, I can bring back some American pale ales or something." This nice kind of friendly email that had no sort of foreboding overtones whatsoever, obviously. And then I got a call from our colleague Tom at about 5 a.m. UK time to kind of tell me the news, but also to tell me to evict Danny's number from various secure messaging groups that we're all a part of, because, we knew that they had Danny's phone and therefore could potentially infiltrate the Signal chat groups that we use, with the reporters and editors. And I wasn't so involved in the response, because I was outside of the country, and there are Frontier colleagues who, were in the country who were able, to talk to the US Embassy and other people that were sort of involved in the response in a more hands-on way. But ultimately, there was not, really a lot that Frontier could do, because once, someone is in the prison system, then, like maybe the embassy can have some contact to the government, but even then, I think it was quite difficult. I mean, maybe Danny knows a little bit more about this now, but I think even the US Embassy didn't have like a whole lot of contact with the government on this. I don't think the authorities were really being very communicative at all. And sort of once someone is in prison and in the court system, it just sort of becomes this rather Kafkaesque process. And I think because Danny was, a US citizen and a foreign national, we knew that like the decision to release him would sort of come from relatively high up. And it's one of those things where it was just incredibly arbitrary. Whatever he's going to be charged with probably wasn't going to serve a full term of whatever. So the weird thing is that we thought, well, he could be released next week, like at the stroke of a pen from some powerful general up in Naypyidaw, or it could be a lot longer.
Yeah, that all rings incredibly true. There was a understanding on my end pretty quickly, like once you had been swept up into this process and into this system, there just wasn't anything that anybody could do. It's all very arbitrary. You know, the way justice and injustice plays out in that system is all arbitrary. You just have to wait until somebody very high up makes a decision. And it became pretty apparent also that the U.S. government, like, you know, early on, I was like, well, maybe, you know, it's the United States of America. Maybe they have some diplomatic channel, or maybe they have some ability to make a demand or to exert pressure. And it became obvious pretty quickly that they just didn't. If they had any formal channels or informal channels, those things existed with the National League for Democracy government, and they just did not have any line of communication with this regime. And then it just became a waiting game, you know.
Danny alluded briefly to a Japanese journalist who was arrested from his flat in Yangon in March, and he faced a similar charge. He was Yuki Kitazumi, I believe his name is, and he was eventually released because of diplomatic intervention from the Japanese. In fact, there was a Japanese special envoy that had, negotiated between the military and the Arakan army, and that sort of seemed to be an example of the fact that because Japan actually did have these quite direct links to the military, like always, and this has been the case for quite a long time with Japan. They haven't just had links to whatever government happened to be in charge, but also quite specifically to the military itself. So that, I think, sort of ended up being used by the Japanese government, I think, quite effectively to get this one Japanese journalist out. And I think with Danny, it just became apparent that the Americans just didn't have that kind of access or that influence that the Japanese government had, and that was a bit of a problem. And that, and often when it comes to these things, like that kind of thing can make a huge difference, because ultimately it's just one general or a small group of generals, who at a stroke of a pen can release someone if they think it can just kind of observe some kind of objective in international relations.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, it's just kind of what governments have a history of engaging and have relationships. And obviously, the Japanese government has had a hand in conflict resolution there. I mean, and I think I've been told, I'm not privy to any details or any information that is not already public, but I've been told that there were people in the Japanese government that were, doing what they could and asking for me to be released. And I still cannot understand why the military found it in their interest to hang on to me that long. They just seemed unwilling to listen to anybody that was asking them to let me go home.
It is a bit of a mystery, and I want to talk about your exceptionality and this side of things again, but I think it might be good to zoom in a bit on insane prison, right? Because there are thousands of Burmese people right now imprisoned around the country, political prisoners who've done nothing wrong. So I'd really love to hear, and I'm sure our audience too, your observations and your reflections. So could you paint a picture for our listeners of life in the prison for Burmese inmates, for all these people who were living normal lives, and then they went to a protest, and now they're in insane prison.
Yeah, I think it was intentional, but there was certainly, particularly early on, but it persisted for a while. There was an intent to keep me separate from folks that had been there for protesting and for specifically political reasons. There was an awareness that this person is a journalist. He may be here collecting stories. And for a very long period in the beginning, for several months, my ward was filled mostly by former low-level government employees that had been charged with sort of public corruption offenses, mostly under the NLD government. These are folks that probably have some sort of family ties to the military. Anytime that I had met a journalist or a student who had attended a protest and we started to talk and have a conversation, these people were immediately like prison officials would come descend on them and move them to a different ward and sort of keep me isolated from them. Everybody that's there, I mean, they know that they're waiting, and it's like a sort of waiting game where their life is just on hold. Depending on some random factors that the government, is deciding on an individual basis, people have different levels of communication with their wife or their children or their brothers and sisters outside. And some people are just not able to communicate with anybody outside, and they're just sitting inside waiting to figure out what's going to happen. Like I was saying, I was shielded from activists, but also shielded from the worst sort of treatment that people had faced. Later on, the amount of people that were being arrested for explicitly political reasons, I think, just became too much to keep them away from my ward. They had to put people somewhere. And I mean, there was one guy in particular who was brought to my area, and he was just basically unable to communicate with anybody. He would spend the entire day pacing. He wasn't engaging in conversation with everybody. We were all pretty worried about his mental health. At a certain point, he wasn't sleeping, and so the prison officials had other prisoners from other sections come just sleep in his cell with him because they were worried that he might try to hurt himself. But there are people that had obviously displayed symptoms of having been tortured, having been kept from sleeping for long periods of time, kept from eating. And this all took place out of sight from me, probably not even in the prison, in some other area. So there was an intentional effort to keep me from witnessing any of that firsthand. But anybody I was able to talk to had used the word torture and had said, before being brought to the prison, we were tortured. And these are all like very quick, short conversations, because as I was saying, most of these people were intentionally kept far away from me.
All right. So I'm getting, I can see you talking to one another. There's communication going on. So what was your daily routine like? Can you describe this ward? This is a very old prison, right? Like, what does it look like? How does it feel? And what were your communications like with other people? But maybe also, after we talk about the prison in that way, what were your communications like with the outside world?
There was an initial period of just trying to figure out where I was and what daily life was like. And luckily there were, out of about maybe 20 or 25 people that were in my ward that you see all day, every day. There are more people outside that you kind of interact with a bit, but this core group of maybe 20 or 25 people, once you start to get to know them a bit, maybe 3 or 4 of them are fluent English speakers, and so you establish a relationship with them. After that, the daily routine became just a pretty normal thing. I would wake up around 4 or 5 a.m. and start reading whatever books that I had there. They unlock the doors at 7 a.m. to keep the reading streak going as long as possible, because that's just killing hours. So more of the day is finished. But then, whenever your attention wavers, you wander outside and have some food and talk to some people. And you're spending the majority of the day just trying to get the time to pass. They had some makeshift weights that people used. So I was like lifting some of these weights with some of the other guys that had established that sort of daily routine. And there's a little bit of conversation like, fuck this government, they're a bunch of assholes. But mostly it was just a regular old chit chat about whatever people wanted to talk about. That was sort of the routine of the day. Is you read as long as you can, and then you try to find other ways to make the hours pass, and then you go back to the book and start reading a little bit more, and just wait until it gets dark out. Just like really, I was always very happy when the day ended and I could just go to sleep. As far as talking to people outside, it took a month before they let me speak with anybody outside of the prison. They had told me I was allowed to write letters to my embassy. So early on, I was writing letters to my embassy, and they told me that they were being delivered. About a month into it, they gave me a phone call with my embassy, and my embassy told me that they had never received any letters or any communication from me at all. So that just wasn't getting out for the first month. But once I got a phone call with the embassy, the U.S. Embassy was trying to establish some regular line of communication. And because of COVID, because of the bureaucratic process, for just a number of reasons, it was never very regular. I would just wait until they would tell me I was allowed to speak to people. For a certain period of time, it was once a week, or it was once every 2 or 3 weeks, and then it would be a month without talking to anybody. And those phone calls were all kind of the exact same thing. It was my consular official saying, "Hello, how are you? Are you okay? Are you being tortured? Well, anyway, here is your family. Here is Juliana. Here are your parents." And then they would just let us talk. And it was a lot of me reassuring them that I was all right. I was, certainly extremely worried about my mother, how she was doing. So when she could hear my voice and I could tell her that I was all right, that was very reassuring. But yeah, those were the conversations, and they would give me little hints about like, yeah, this story is being covered. People know about it. We're doing everything we can, but details beyond that were pretty hard to come by.
I imagine that given your daily routine, and the way that you talk about killing hours, that these communications and I guess the court hearings were kind of what punctuated the whole time you were there, right? Is that how you marked time?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, exactly. Court hearings, phone calls. There weren't a whole lot of milestones outside of that to gauge anything on. I had known about Nathan Mong, who was a U.S. Citizen, a Burmese American dual citizen, who had been held, who was in journalism and media, and who maybe 2.5 months or so into his detainment, his court case was just stopped, just like, on a dime, and dismissed. He was acquitted, I think, and sent home. And I had that as like a goalpost to get to. I was like, well, if they send him home between 2 and 3 months into it, maybe that's how long this will take. That was the longest precedent I had been aware of. So I was trying to get to that, and then that came and went, and I just had no guideposts for what I should be expecting or how long it would take.
And on the outside, Ben, I know Frontier was doing its digging, and as you say, Danny, there was a media campaign and your family was really active. Part of this was trying to figure out exactly why Danny was actually in prison in the first place. And this was a little bit Byzantine, right? So either of you can answer, do we actually know now for sure why Danny was imprisoned?
Frontier got a copy of the case file. We're able to get that from the court, and it was all about Myanmar Now. Really, it was that Danny's work for Myanmar Now, or the work he was allegedly still doing was contravening these laws. So there was the 505A charge on the penal code, which is this sort of very broad incitement charge that the junta then tweaked after the coup to include the deliberate spreading of fake news. But then there was also an immigration charge and an unlawful association charge. But the whole thing, was under the false premise that Danny was still working for Myanmar Now, or was at the time of the coup, when Danny had in fact left the organization to work for Frontier in the middle of 2020. But in terms of how they actually tried to prove that, or the actual sort of real substance or the meat of the case, I don't know. I don't know how much of that you could glean, Danny, or what it actually amounted to in the courtroom.
Yeah. It seemed to me fairly obvious fairly quickly on the part of the police that were asking me questions and interrogating me. And then later, lawyers and the judge and everybody in the courtroom, that nobody believed that I worked for Myanmar Now. It seemed pretty clear that somebody in the government, they had raided the Myanmar Now newsroom. I remember that, that was a story. They were raiding a lot of newsrooms. And my name was on some document. I didn't even know this and was not aware of it. And that's how my name got on some list. But, it took about 10 or 15 minutes of questioning for everybody to be pretty convinced that yeah, this guy is not lying. He used to work for Myanmar. Now he doesn't work for them anymore. Uh, I think everybody knows that you get some paperwork from the Ministry of Information. There's no reason to assume that that's up to date or accurate, you know? So I was demanding from Myanmar now that I have a legal visa to stay there and work there legitimately. And so they had to file some paperwork, and they probably, when I left, did not feel the need to update that paperwork because all of these formal systems there are a bit of a sham, to be honest. That they found a document at the Ministry of Information or at the Myanmar Now office and believed that to be an accurate representation of anything related to reality blows my mind. And I think is just like another example of how little this military knows what's actually going on the street level. But I think that after that questioning and after that realization, they had already set in motion a process where everybody was doing their little part of a job, and nobody, had the authority to halt the whole thing. So everybody just had to let it play out. At a certain point, I think because my family had been doing, the remarkable work that they were doing to keep this story in the news, I think the government, the military deemed it in their interest to hang on to me a little bit longer to see if they could get something out of it. And not to say that that's, that it made the situation worse, because I think that attention also is what in the end got me out of there. But I think that, maybe the reason it lasted as long as it did was that the government felt that I had become a symbol of them not being bossed around, or maybe I had become a bargaining chip that they could get something out of.
Yeah, and your eventual release it ended up being pretty dramatic. Many of us were following it blow by blow, as it involved multiple flights and the intervention from high-profile foreign interlocutors, which are pretty rare, right? Not many people, even today, are flying to Naypyidaw and having conversations with the SAC. I mean, Hun Sen is the latest rare example. So when did you find out you were being released? I mean, did you believe it? And what was your experience of, say, the last few days that you were in prison?
The last few days that I was in prison, after I'd been sentenced, I was sentenced on a Friday, convicted and sentenced on a Friday. On Saturday morning, they pulled me out of the cell and gave me a COVID swab test, which I didn't know that they had tests. Like everybody in that prison had COVID and nobody was being tested. So that was a whole separate thing. And when I told all the guys that I was staying in a ward with that they had just given me a test, everybody was like, wow, that is clearly a sign that they're putting you on an international flight. They're going to send you home. But I had already so many false good signs that did not end up, resulting in me going home at the end of those days. So I just said, yeah, maybe that's true, but maybe they're just getting ready to transfer me to a different prison. And that was Saturday morning. So Saturday and Sunday, I was just waiting to see why they had given me this COVID test. I didn't know what was going on. And then Monday morning, they came and they said, pack a bag, you're being moved. But they wouldn't give me any other details. Everybody around me was, certain that I was about to be sent home, but I was still like in this mindset of I'm no longer going to listen anytime anybody tells me that, because it's just too frustrating to start believing it again. And then that entire day, that Monday, I was released on a Monday at night or in the evening. That entire day, nobody would confirm what was happening. I was being moved and driven to different places. It seemed like we were driving towards the Yangon airport at one point in the day. And then the car that I was in just went right past the airport and then left the city of Yangon. And I didn't know where we were going. I still have no idea why they took me to Naypyidaw and had me leave from there. But that entire day, I didn't know until just before they sort of handed me over to this group of, white men in suits, which was Bill Richardson, my consular representative, some other folks that worked at the embassy. I didn't know who any of these people were, but until the moment we were at the airport in Naypyidaw and they just sort of handed me over, did I know that was certainly what was happening. The entire day, nobody would confirm anything. So I was just waiting to see what would happen.
That must have been the strangest drive to Naypyidaw. What was that like? Did they stop? Did you go to mile 115 and have one last bowl of Nanji Tho?
No. It was a very strange drive. It was a completely silent drive the entire time. And I kept trying to like start small conversations with these guys. I was handcuffed to a guy who had a large rifle, one of these very old rifles that all the police in Yangon have. And everyone was looking straight ahead at the road for several hours. Right when we left Yangon and we went through Haigu Township, I just as a way to try to start a conversation, I turned to that guy and I said, this is Haigu, right? Are we going to stop here or anything? And he just turned to me and he said, don't speak. He said, stop speaking. And that was the last bit of conversation for several hours that entire day. And it was just sitting around waiting for people to tell me what I was waiting for. I really had no idea what their plan was.
And then you got on a plane to Qatar with white men in suits. What happened then?
So it was the Bill Richardson Foundation. So Bill Richardson is a former state governor in the United States. I had no idea that his post-public office career had been around, American hostages abroad and trying to secure their release. But apparently that's what he had been up to. I knew who he was because he had once run for president as a candidate in the Democratic primaries in the United States. He was the governor in New Mexico. I'm not from New Mexico. So outside of his primary candidacy, I hadn't had a ton of familiarity with him. But basically, we got on the plane. 2 employees that worked for his foundation were there, and they said, how much do you want to know about what we did? And I said, tell me everything. There wasn't much for them to say. It was basically, we came to Myanmar to talk about how we could help with humanitarian COVID assistance. They sort of told me what I think they've been telling the press in general, which is, we came to talk about COVID. We did not come to talk about your release, but we suggested to them that it would be a very good, tied to nothing in terms of humanitarian relief or in exchange for anything. We suggested to them that it would be a good sign to the rest of the world if you released this person on humanitarian grounds. And, they found it convincing. And then that's what happened. I don't know. I'm sure there were many, many conversations that played a part in Min Aung Hlaing's final decision to let me go home. But this was probably one of many conversations. But then we were on a plane. It was a private jet. So it was just us and beer and coffee and some food and celebration. It was a very euphoric mood.
Yeah, I can only imagine going through something like that and what that must have felt like as you looked out the window and ascended into the sky.
Yeah, and called my family without a bunch of prison staff members listening and monitoring the conversation.
So, Ben, what's your read on how this all went down? You were following it forensically outside. What's your theory about how Danny finally came to be released?
I don't know much more than that. At Frontier, we weren't really in the loop. And, obviously there were these very closely held conversations among the Richardson Center and the American Embassy and the State Department, and it seems Japan as well. However, that was quite a tight circle, and Frontier, and I think also Danny's family was not part of that, I don't think. So, we heard similar rumors to everyone else that, the real reason that Bill Richardson was going there was to try to get Danny out, and that this whole thing about making it easier for shipments of COVID vaccines to arrive was just a cover story. And then I remember that was the general assumption, but then Bill Richardson's journey kind of came and went, and he left the country and Danny was still in prison. So we think, okay, well, if that was the objective, then it didn't work. But then, just a few days afterwards, Bill was back in the country, and then he was flying out again very quickly. I don't know if he was in the country for like less than a day or something. He just went back to get Danny. And but sort of in retrospect, it sort of followed a particular pattern that maybe we should have expected anyway, in that Bill came in that initial meeting when, whether he talked mostly about vaccines or whether he talked mostly about Danny, like, we don't know. But then obviously after that, then Min Aung Hlaing made up his mind, or the Home Minister or whoever really made the call. Because then as soon as that happened, then Danny's case was wrapped up incredibly quickly. Like, I can't remember exactly all the details, but I think you had hearing every day and they just kind of cycled through all the remaining witnesses and just sort of gave you a big conviction and put a bow on it, like just to kind of prove, quote unquote, that, you were in prison for a reason, and that you actually like were a danger to the country, and that, they hadn't made a mistake. So by convicting, that was their way of proving, if only to themselves, that they hadn't made a mistake. So it was the sort of formality that they had to cycle through Danny's case, conviction, and then release afterwards, because then there is a pardon, which is, like a common thing, in that it's actually quite rare that a political prisoner will serve their full term. They'll often be pardoned at some point, either, quite soon or quite a few years down the track. Yeah. But in terms of like, what was really happening behind the scenes, I mean, we sort of know a little bit now that Japan was involved in some way, perhaps a few other countries, but at Frontier, we certainly weren't told more than anyone else was. And I don't think a huge amount has really come to light since. And I think there was this speculation as to, did the US government kind of concede anything? Like, what did the junta get out of it? And I think it's still not very clear, or what they actually got out of it, really, other than the sort of slight diplomatic coup of having this important American politician kind of fly in and have a meeting with Min Aung Hlaing when he's in his throne room in Naypyidaw, looking very grand on a gilded chair or something, and like those photos, which I suppose is like some kind of plus for the junta, but it kind of seems like a drop in the ocean. Like, I don't think it's going to change many people's minds within the country seeing that, and I don't think it's going to change the minds of many world leaders or people around the world. So yeah.
So, Ben, you spent the majority, can we say, or a huge proportion of your early working life in Myanmar, working on Myanmar. And Danny, you lived in Myanmar for less years than Ben, but you spent 6 months in prison. So how do you both look back on your different experiences in Myanmar, which played such important and, we can say, formative roles in your personal lives? Like, how do you each think about your Myanmar time, and maybe how do you explain it to new people that you meet at the pub?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I guess I would say, like, what the things that had drawn me there, I think were my own sort of intellectual questions and interests that I wanted to sort of explore by moving there and doing journalism there. And then having gone through this whole experience made me, it was less about any personal questions that I wanted to explore, and more like, now I just feel like a much stronger connection to sort of the fate of the country in terms of individual people's future. This whole experience, having close friends that are Myanmar citizens, watching this experience radicalize them, in a Western democratic country, you're pretty removed from the wars that your country fights and the decision that individuals make to enlist. But witnessing people that had not necessarily been political give everything up and take up arms to fight this thing that had happened, their entire future just depends on how this all plays out. And how do you not have an emotional investment in that now? I think it definitely changed. When I was going to the airport, I think I had thought, well, I want to stay connected to Frontier and I want to stay interested and invested in Myanmar. But it looks like there's not much of a future for journalists there. So I'm going to start figuring out where I'm going to move to next and tying up loose ends. And now I feel like, well, you can't really tie up loose ends. I feel like I have to stay involved and interested and connected to this story, to this event, to this process, in a much more committed and personal way.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that, Danny. And Ben, how about you? How do you talk about it? What do you think about your time in Myanmar?
I mean, I'll give the long view. So I moved to start working in the country in 2014. And that was really the high watermark of optimism within the country. I mean, you could say that the 2015 election was that moment, but in 2014, the election was still ahead. A lot of people moving to the country, both foreign people, but also a lot of Burmese that had been exiled for a long time. And I think there was a lot of trepidation and a lot of skepticism about how genuine a lot of the changes were. But I think there was a sense that people sort of wanted to make use of the space that was newly available. They saw it maybe as an opportunity. Like, for instance, I remember in 2014, 2015, interviewing a lot of members of political parties and, that had signed up to compete in the 2015 election. And a lot of them said, they don't really believe it's going to be free and fair, or not quite that, but they were like, well, we'll believe it when we see it. We don't really trust the military or the sort of civilian proxy administration that they put in place via the USDP. We don't, we'll believe it when we see it. But at the same time, they did want to compete in the election because I think many people felt they had exhausted other options. They'd maybe been dissidents for a long time. And I think that there was a sense that there was something to play for, even if they didn't feel fully confident about it. And I think it's we kind of look at the result of the 2015 election kind of as an inevitable thing. But I remember right up until election day, with the results coming in, there was a lot of nervousness about, would it be free and fair? There was a lot of rumors about, the UEC, the election commission at the time, is allegedly doing this or that. So everyone was really holding their breath. And then suddenly, the results came in and it was what the people broadly wanted, and people were ecstatic. And, being there at that time was extremely exciting. And it was the sense that, there was a lot of reasons to distrust what's going on, but people wanted to make it the most of the space that was available. That's why a lot of political exiles did come back, particularly after 2012, including members of the media. The lifting of censorship in 2012 was a big watershed moment. And working at media, for instance, I worked at the Irrawaddy first. There was this sense of this sort of overnight change in that, there was a very old school censorship process before 2012 when, you had to send stuff to a censorship board and then, it would come back with a lot of kind of red lines. So if you talk to anyone who used to work at the Myanmar Times at the bad old days, they have to prepare a backup story. They might have to scrap the whole front page, for instance. And it sounds kind of mad, really, but that was what it was like. And then suddenly it changed. And when I arrived, it seemed like there was a new publication, opening each month. I look at the newsstands in Yangon and there'd just be this random journal that I never heard of before that was just there. And it just felt like a free-for-all, really. And everyone who'd ever wanted to have their own little weekly journal or newspaper was just kind of piling in. So to feel that I was kind of working as part of that, it sort of felt worthwhile, it felt exciting to be a part of. And now in a situation where it seems like all those gains have been swept away, both the gains of the election, that, there was this election process that people didn't know whether they could trust. And then, it turned out the way that they wanted. And then the media was able to grow, it had this sort of messy growth period and then consolidated a bit. And now, it's basically not safe to work as a journalist in the country. A lot of the important media organizations have been banned. A lot of them are working in exile now. So on one level, it sort of feels like everything I, was a part of and the people that I knew had all worked towards has sort of gone up in smoke. But that's only really if you accept that the military is just going to rule now. And it sounds like they're in way too deep now for any kind of patch-up deal. But I think it all hangs in a balance and there's all to play for, really. And I think there's such a strong determination to resist from so many corners of society, because I think this is seen as an existential fight. I think a lot of people in Myanmar just don't really see any future under military rule. So like they're not going to give up anytime soon. And I don't think that time necessary is on the military side. So when, better tomorrow does come, then, all that experience and all those gains will come to bear, and we'll see the results of those, and it won't just be starting with a blank slate.
Okay, and the final question's a bit weird. It's for Danny. There's a lot of photos of you in a colourful beanie. It drew a bit of media attention. You exited the country in this beanie, and you made a comment that it was a present. So what's the story behind this beanie that came with you out of insane prison?
I wish there was a more exciting story behind it. Maybe I'll have to start working on inventing one. But there's just a little bit of sort of informal trade that goes on in the prison, especially when somebody is preparing to leave. If they've gotten word that they've become eligible for bail, or they've gotten a pardon or something. And around the end of October, there was a mass pardon, and a bunch of guys were getting ready to leave. And if they don't give individual items away, then the prison just seizes them. Sort of staff members take them, and I'm not sure what they do. I think they try to sell them or barter or whatever they can. And one of the guys, my hair had gotten so long, I wanted just a headband or something to keep the hair out of my eyes. And this one guy was getting ready to leave, so he gave me the hat. And I was very appreciative for the hat, just to keep the hair out of my eyes. And that, really, there's not much more to it than that.
Hey, that's cool to finally get to the bottom of that radical beanie that came with you. Hope you've put it somewhere safe. I can imagine that's quite a memento. Before we go to recommendations, is there anything that you'd like to add?
There are citizens, and particularly journalists, that as a foreigner, I was shielded from the worst of what this military does. And, there are people with much more horrific and much more important stories than my own experience. And it's going to be difficult but important to continue telling those and getting them in front of everybody's eyes, getting the world to sort of continue to pay attention.
Yeah, totally. Okay, at the end of every episode of Myanmar Musings, we always do recommendations. So I'm guessing that you, Danny, do not recommend Insane Prison, but you did read a lot of books. So maybe you read a good book in the prison you'd like to recommend, or it could be anything you like. It doesn't have to be a book. What would you like to recommend?
I'll share a very funny anecdote. It took a while for me to get communication with anybody on the outside, which included telling Juliana books that I wanted to read that she could. Eventually, she was able to bring me some books, drop them off at the prison. Before I could make any requests, there had been a book that was published called Educated by Tara Westover that I had put on my to-read list for when I got back to the United States, because I thought it would just be too hard to find it in Myanmar. And randomly, but this book had been on my mind, and randomly the first couple days that I was in prison, one of the guys in my ward had that book, and he had a copy of it, which is really bizarre. But that was a very fascinating read. I'd recommend that book. It is this woman's sort of memoir of growing up with her parents were fundamentalist Mormons, and they kept her and her family completely secluded from the rest of society. And I think in part of that fundamentalism was also a lot of mental health issues. I think her parents were pretty unstable, but she wound up going to one of the American Ivy League schools. I don't remember where it was Harvard or Princeton, but just a remarkable story and a pretty good storyteller. So that was pretty fascinating. That kept me entertained for about a day and a half.
All right, Educated. That's a good one. And How about you, Ben?
I'd like to tout this new book that's coming out in time for the 1 year anniversary of the coup. It's a collection of translated poems, short essays about the resistance to the coup or the experience of it, so it's sort of written by people, who are sort of on the front lines of protests or in these PDF armed groups, or just ordinary citizens who were there, or people who had to flee the country. And some of it's original English, but most of it is in Burmese and being translated. And I think it's really important to sort of read the revolution, so to speak, in the Burmese people's own words. That's being released in a number of different countries. I know it's being published in Singapore and Britain and the US and probably other countries too. It's called Kicking Off New Shoots Will Not Stop the Spring. So look out for that, everyone.
Awesome. That sounds cool. Picking off new shoots will not stop the spring. Look forward to that.
Yeah, look out for it, everyone.
And thank you so much, Ben. And especially thank you so much, Danny, for coming on here and talking about what was quite an ordeal, and you suffered through it and survived it with aplomb. I think it's a real testament to your character. Incredible.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. Long time listener.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a real pleasure to be back on the podcast, Luke. I'm also a mega fan. And I hope you keep this going for all the years to come.
Cool.
And I think we can all look forward to having a few cold Berbericks in Chiang Mai someday together.
Yeah, that would be absolutely sensational.
Yes, please.
Yeah.